A 9-year-old girl stands on a splintered platform in Red Hollow, shielding her 3-year-old sister from buyers who see only labor and profit. When a man demands the older child alone, Lena's refusal cuts through the crowd, until a silent stranger steps forward and changes everything. Will these sisters survive being separated, or will one man's quiet defiance rewrite their fate? Stay with us until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so we can see how far this story travels. The dust never settled in Red Hollow. It hung in the air like judgment, clinging to cotton dresses and leather boots, coating tongues and throats, until every breath tasted of desperation. The town square baked under a merciless August sun, the kind that turned wood to kindling and patience to ash. Heat shimmered off the rutted street where wagon wheels had carved deep scars into earth that remembered every transaction, every exchange, every life weighed and found wanting. Lena stood on the auction block with her spine straight and her jaw locked, one hand pressed against her sister's small shoulder. Mara clung to Lena's skirt, barefoot and trembling, her face buried against faded calico. 3 years old and already learning that the world was a place where children were merchandise, where family was a luxury measured in coin. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Tully with tobacco-stained teeth, gestured lazily toward them. His voice carried across the assembled crowd with the practiced indifference of someone who'd sold everything from horses to hope. 2 girls, he announced, scratching at his beard. Older one's 9, maybe 10, young enough to train, old enough to work. Little one's barely weaned, but she'll grow into usefulness soon enough. Lena felt Mara's fingers tighten against her leg. She wanted to cover her sister's ears, to shield her from words that turned them into objects with no more significance than tools or livestock. But her hands stayed visible, kept deliberately at her sides where everyone could see them. She'd learned that much already. Hidden hands made buyers nervous. Nervous buyers asked questions. Questions led to separation. "Can work a full day?" someone called from the sparse crowd. "The older one can," Tully confirmed, squinting against the glare. "Kitchen work, laundry, basic sewing. She's had training." Training. The word sat bitter in Lena's mouth. Training meant the orphanage in Kansas City, where children learned to serve before they learned to read, where obedience was beaten into young backs with willow switches and deprivation. She'd spent 6 years there before they'd given up on placing her with a proper family. Too old, they'd said. Too serious. Too quiet. Then Mara had arrived, a squalling infant left on the orphanage steps with nothing but a scrap of blanket and a note that said only, "Please." They'd tried to keep the sisters separated. Infants required different care, different facilities. But Lena had fought that separation with every stubborn fiber in her small body. She'd refused food, refused sleep, refused everything until they'd relented and let her tend the baby during designated hours. When the orphanage had run out of funding and patience, they'd packed the children into wagons and sent them west to territories where labor was scarce and questions were scarcer. The journey had taken 3 weeks, each mile carrying them further from anything resembling home and closer to places where desperation bought and sold without ceremony. Now they stood in Red Hollow, displayed like produce at market, waiting to discover what their lives would cost. A woman in faded green stepped closer to the platform, her face weathered by sun and circumstance. She studied them with the calculating gaze of someone who understood value down to the penny. "The little one looks sickly," she observed. "Just needs feeding up," Tully assured her. "Nothing a few good meals won't fix." Mara wasn't sickly. She was small, delicate in the way of children who'd spent their earliest months uncertain whether the next meal would arrive. Her hair hung in tangled brown waves, and her dress, a hand-me-down from the orphanage that had never fit properly, draped on her thin frame like cloth on a scarecrow. But her eyes were clear, bright with the kind of intelligence that didn't depend on size or strength. How much for just the older girl? The question came from a man Lena hadn't noticed before, standing at the edge of the crowd with his thumbs hooked in his belt. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat pulled low, his face shadowed but his interest evident. The way he looked at her made Lena's stomach clench. "Prefer to sell them together," Tully said, though his tone suggested flexibility. Everything was flexible when profit was involved. Don't need 2 mouths to feed," the man replied. "One's plenty for the work I got." Lena felt the words like a physical blow. She'd known this moment was coming, had dreaded it through every mile of the journey west. The orphanage had promised they'd be placed together, but promises made in Kansas City held no weight in territories where survival trumped sentiment. Her hand found Mara's head, fingers tangling gently in the mess of her sister's hair. The little girl looked up, eyes wide with the kind of trust that could break a person. "Together," Lena whispered, so quiet only Mara could hear. "Speak up, girl," Tully barked. "Buyers don't like mumblers." Lena lifted her chin. Her voice came stronger than she felt. Each word pushed past fear and into the dusty air where everyone could hear. "Don't take her. She's only 3. The crowd rippled with uncomfortable laughter. A child advocating for a child, as if their preferences mattered. As if they had any say in transactions conducted by adults with money and authority. "Nobody's asking what you want," the potential buyer said flatly. "She can't work yet," Lena pressed, hating the desperation creeping into her tone but unable to stop it. "She's too small. She needs feeding. You said so yourself." The man turned to Tully. "How much for just the older one?" $12. The price hung in the air. $12 for a life, for years of labor, for everything Lena might become. It sounded impossibly small and devastatingly large all at once. Mara's crying had gone quiet, reduced to small hiccuping sounds that tore at Lena more than wailing would have. The little girl understood, in the way children do, that something terrible was happening. That the promises Lena had whispered to her at night, "I'll keep you safe, I'll never leave you," were about to shatter like glass against stone. "12's fair," the buyer said, reaching into his pocket. Lena's mind raced through impossible scenarios. She could run, could grab Mara and bolt into the street, but where would they go? How far would a 9-year-old and a toddler get before they were caught and dragged back? She could fight, but fighting led to punishment, and punishment in territories like this could mean things worse than separation. "Wait." The voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet but carrying enough authority that people turned. A man stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the rutted street. He was tall, lean in the way of people who worked hard and ate simply, with dark hair visible beneath a weathered hat and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Elias Crow had been standing at the edge of the auction since it began, watching transactions unfold with the detached interest of someone with no intention of participating. He'd come to town for supplies, nails, flour, coffee, not for children. His cabin sat 3 hours northeast by horse, tucked into wilderness where neighbors were measured in miles rather than shouting distance. He lived alone by choice, had done so for 7 years since fever had taken his wife and stillborn daughter in the same brutal week. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't planned to intervene. But something in the older girl's voice, in the way she stood rigid with fear but wouldn't let herself break, had stirred something he'd thought long buried. Tully squinted at the newcomer. "You buying?" "Depends." Elias moved closer to the platform, his boots stirring dust with each step. He stopped at the base of the rough-hewn stairs, looking up at the 2 girls with an expression that gave nothing away. "They sisters?" "So we're told," Tully confirmed. "Why?" "Won't separate them." The words landed like stones in water, ripples spreading through the watching crowd. The original buyer scowled, his hand still in his pocket, where coins waited. "Already made my offer," the man said, defensive. "Make a better one." Elias didn't look at him, his attention fixed on Lena. "They stay together or nobody buys today." Tully's expression shifted, calculating new possibilities. 2 children were harder to place than 1, but a bidding war, even a small one, could drive prices up. He scratched his beard again, buying time to think. "Girl's asking price was 12. You want both, it's 25 total." "That's robbery," someone in the crowd muttered. "That's business," Tully shot back. Elias studied the girls. The older one watched him with wary eyes, trying to determine whether this was salvation or simply a different kind of threat. The little one had stopped crying, her attention caught by the quiet man who spoke as if children's wishes actually mattered. $25 was more than Elias had intended to spend today. It was more than he'd spent on himself in half a year. His cabin was spare, furnished with necessities and nothing else. He grew what food he could, hunted and trapped the rest, lived within strict means that allowed no waste. But he thought of his wife, who'd wanted children so desperately that losing their daughter had broken something fundamental inside her. He thought of the empty cabin, of meals eaten in silence, of evenings that stretched long with only firelight and memory for company. He thought of the girl's voice, clear despite her fear. "Don't take her, she's only 3. 25, Elias agreed. The original buyer spat in the dust, disgusted. "Waste of good money. Little one won't be useful for years." "Then it's fortunate I'm not asking your opinion." Elias pulled coins from his pocket, counting them out in his palm. The money felt heavier than it should, weighted with implications he hadn't fully considered. He was a solitary man by nature and necessity. Adding 2 children to his isolated life would change everything: routines, resources, the very shape of his days. But children shouldn't stand on auction blocks like livestock. They shouldn't have to beg not to be separated from the only family they had left. He handed the money to Tully, who counted it twice before nodding satisfaction. "They're yours. Standard contract applies. You're responsible for feeding, clothing, and any trouble they cause. Town won't intervene in discipline matters, but if they run or cause problems, that's your concern." "Understood." Elias turned to face the platform fully. "You two, come down." Lena hesitated. She'd been bought before, not officially, but in the casual way of orphanages that handed children to farmers and shopkeepers who promised room and board in exchange for work. Those arrangements had never ended well. She'd been returned to the orphanage twice, both times for asking too many questions or working too slowly or simply existing in ways that disappointed the adults who'd taken her in temporarily. But Mara was crying again, and the alternative was being separated, and at least this stranger had insisted they stay together. That had to count for something. She took Mara's hand and descended the rough stairs carefully, feeling splinters catch at her already torn skirt. The crowd was already dispersing, interest fading now that the transaction was complete. In Red Hollow, children were bought and sold every week. This was nothing remarkable. Elias knelt when they reached ground level, bringing his eyes closer to Lena's height. Up close, she could see the sun-weathered lines around his eyes, the gray threading through dark hair at his temples. He looked tired. Not cruel, not angry, just tired in the way of people who'd carried weight for too long. "Your name?" he asked quietly. "Lena." Her voice came rough from dust and fear. "This is Mara." Lena and Mara. He tested the names like he was trying them on. "I'm Elias Crow. My cabin's about 3 hours from here, northeast up into the foothills. It's remote, quiet. The work is hard, but it's fair. I won't beat you, and I won't starve you. Those are my only promises right now." Lena wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What work? What rules? How long would he keep them before he got tired of feeding extra mouths and brought them back to whatever orphanage or auction would take them? But her throat was too dry, and Mara was leaning heavy against her leg, exhausted from fear and heat. "Can you ride?" Elias gestured toward a horse tied at the far end of the street, a solid bay gelding with patient eyes. "No." "Then you'll learn. Come on." He straightened and started walking, not checking whether they followed. Lena glanced at the emptying square, at the auction block where other children still waited for buyers, at the dusty street that led to nothing familiar. Then she lifted Mara onto her hip, awkward because her sister was getting too big for carrying but still light enough that Lena could manage, and followed. The horse regarded them calmly as Elias untied the reins and began adjusting saddle straps. He worked with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this thousands of times, who understood animals and equipment with the kind of fluency that came from necessity rather than affection. "You'll ride with me," he told Lena. "Hold your sister in front of you. If you feel yourself slipping, say so. I'd rather stop than scrape either of you off the trail." He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached down. Lena stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from work she couldn't begin to imagine. Everything in her had learned to be wary of adults, of their promises and their expectations. But she'd also learned that sometimes you simply had to trust that the next step wouldn't end in falling. She gripped his hand. He pulled her up with surprising gentleness, settling her in front of him on the saddle before helping arrange Mara between Lena's arms. It was crowded, uncomfortable, But the horse stood steady beneath the added weight. "Hold tight," Elias murmured. The horse moved forward at his command, hooves clopping against packed earth as they left Red Hollow behind. Lena looked back once, watching the town shrink into dust and distance. The auction block stood empty now, waiting for next week's desperate transactions. She turned forward, focusing on the rhythm of the horse's gait, on Mara's weight warm and real in her arms. Whatever came next, whether kindness or just a different kind of hardship, at least they would face it together. The landscape changed as they rode, town giving way to scrub grass and scattered pine, hills rising in gentle slopes that promised wilderness beyond. The sun tracked westward, heat beginning to ease as afternoon stretched toward evening. Elias didn't speak, but his presence behind them felt oddly steady, his hands managing reins with the kind of confidence that suggested he knew exactly where he was going. After an hour, he slowed the horse near a narrow creek that cut through rock and sage. The water ran clear over smooth stones, cold enough that steam would rise from it come winter mornings. "We'll rest," he said, dismounting before helping the girls down. Lena's legs trembled when her feet hit ground, muscles protesting unfamiliar hours in the saddle. Mara immediately sat, rubbing her eyes and whimpering softly. The little girl hadn't spoken since the auction, hadn't done anything but cling and cry and try to make herself smaller. Elias pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to Lena. "Water's clean. Drink slow." She uncorked the canteen and held it to Mara's lips first, watching her sister drink in small, careful sips. The orphanage had taught her that. Tend to the youngest first. Ensure the most vulnerable were cared for before seeing to yourself. It was a lesson that had kept Mara alive through months of scarcity. When Mara finished, Lena drank. The water tasted sweet, untainted by the metallic edge that often came from pumps and wells in town. It washed dust from her throat, eased the ache that had settled behind her eyes. "There's jerky in the saddlebag," Elias said, tending to the horse. "Dried apple, too. Take what you need." Lena approached the saddlebag cautiously, half expecting this to be some kind of test. Adults often offered things and then punished you for accepting. But Elias just continued working, checking the horse's hooves and adjusting straps, giving the girls space to eat without hovering. The jerky was tough, salty, requiring serious chewing. The dried apple was sweeter than anything Lena had tasted in months. She gave most of both to Mara, who ate mechanically, her eyes distant. "How old did you say she was?" Elias asked, not looking up from his work. 3. Almost 4. Talks? Sometimes. Lena hesitated. She used to, more, before they'd been loaded into wagons and told they were being sent somewhere better. Before the long journey where adults spoke in low voices about children who didn't make it, who got sick, or simply vanished between one stop and the next. Before the auction block. Elias nodded slowly. "Quiet's not always bad. World's noisy enough without adding to it." He let the horse drink from the creek, patient while the animal took its time. When it finished, he gestured for the girls to climb back up. The process was easier this time, Lena's muscles beginning to remember the motion required. They rode another 2 hours, the landscape growing steeper and wilder. Pine trees thickened into genuine forest, and the trail narrowed to barely more than a suggestion worn into earth by repeated passage. The air cooled, carried the scent of sap and wild herbs that Lena couldn't name. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun was painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. The structure sat in a natural clearing, backed by dense forest and fronted by a small stream that probably ran from the same source as the creek where they'd stopped earlier. It was small, solidly built from logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney that suggested warmth come winter. A rough corral held space for the horse, and a modest garden showed signs of recent harvest, the kind of practical growing that produced beans and squash and potatoes rather than anything decorative. Everything about the place spoke of careful survival, of someone who understood that in country, this remote carelessness meant death. Elias dismounted and helped the girls down. Mara immediately pressed against Lena's legs, overwhelmed by strangeness and exhaustion. Lena felt similarly drained, but she forced herself to stand straight, to take in details that might matter later. "Stable first," Elias said, leading the horse toward the corral. Then I'll show you inside. The stable was just 3 walls and a roof, open to the south to catch winter sun. It held basic equipment, saddles, bridles, tools for grooming and care. Everything was clean, well-maintained, organized with the precision of someone who lived alone and couldn't afford to waste time searching for misplaced items. Elias worked efficiently, removing tack and rubbing the horse down with practiced motions. Lena watched, filing away information about how he handled the animal, what he checked, how he measured grain into a feed bucket. "You'll learn this," he said, noticing her attention. "Both of you, eventually. Horse care, garden work, basic maintenance. Can't live out here without pulling your weight." There it was, the expectation. Lena had been waiting for it. Nobody took in children out of pure kindness. There was always work, always debt to be repaid. "Yes, sir," she murmured. "Elias," he corrected, hanging the saddle on a wall peg. "I'm not your master, and this isn't servitude. You work because everyone works. You eat because everyone eats. Clear?" Lena nodded, though she didn't entirely believe him. Adults said things. Sometimes they meant them, sometimes they didn't. Time would reveal which kind Elias was. He led them toward the cabin, pulling open the heavy door and stepping aside so they could enter first. The interior was dim, lit only by fading daylight through small windows. As Lena's eyes adjusted, the space revealed itself in practical sections. A cooking area with a stone hearth and iron pots, a rough table with 2 benches, shelves lined with supplies in careful rows, and a bed against the far wall, neatly made with wool blankets. "Only 1 bed," Elias acknowledged, following her gaze. "I'll build another tomorrow. For tonight, you 2 take this one. I'll sleep on the floor near the fire." "We can—" Lena started. "You'll take the bed," he repeated, firm but not harsh. "Arguing wastes time, and I'm tired." He moved to the hearth, building a fire with quick efficiency. Soon flames caught and spread, orange light pushing back shadows and bringing warmth to the evening chill. He hung a pot over the flames and added water from a bucket near the door, then rummaged through supplies until he found what he needed: dried beans, an onion, a few strips of salt pork. "Supper's simple tonight," he said, dropping ingredients into the pot. "Tomorrow I'll cook proper. Tonight we just need something hot." Lena watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way he wasted nothing. When the soup began to bubble, he ladled generous portions into wooden bowls and carried them to the table. "Sit." They sat. Lena pulled Mara onto her lap. The little girl barely awake now. The soup was plain but good, flavored with salt and the slight sweetness of onion. It was more than Lena had expected, more than she'd eaten in a single sitting since leaving the orphanage. Elias ate quickly, efficiently, his attention on the meal rather than the girls. When he finished, he stood and began preparing the bed, adding extra blankets and arranging things so 2 small bodies would fit comfortably. "Outhouse is out back, 30 feet straight from the door," he said, pointing. "Chamber pot's under the bed if you can't make it that far at night. Water in the bucket's clean for drinking. Fire goes out around midnight, gets cold before morning. Extra blankets are on the shelf if you need them." He was listing facts, giving information without emotional weight. Lena appreciated that. Kindness she didn't trust, but practical information she could use. "Any questions?" Elias asked. "Rules?" Lena managed. He considered this, leaning against the table. "Don't waste food, don't damage tools, don't wander so far you get lost. Keep the fire safe. Never leave flame unattended. Tell me if something hurts or breaks or stops working right." He paused. "And don't lie to me. I won't tolerate that." Simple rules. Harsh maybe, but clear. Lena nodded understanding. "Good." Elias moved toward the corner where he'd arranged blankets for himself. "Sleep now. Morning comes early." Lena carried Mara to the bed, tucking her sister beneath heavy blankets that smelled of wood smoke and sage. The mattress was straw, but it was soft compared to the wagon beds they'd endured for weeks. Mara was asleep almost immediately, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of exhaustion. Lena lay beside her, still fully dressed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling where firelight danced in wavering patterns. Across the room, Elias had already settled into his blankets near the hearth, his back to them, body gone still. She wanted to feel safe, wanted to believe that this place, this quiet man who'd insisted they stay together, might actually be what he seemed, but safety was a luxury Lena had learned not to expect. The world broke promises too easily, turned kindness into something sharp and cutting. So she stayed awake, listening to the fire crackle and the wind move through pines outside, memorizing the sounds of this new place. When sleep finally came, it was thin and fractured, full of dreams where auction blocks stretched endlessly and voices called out prices for things that had no names. Morning arrived cold and gray, dawn breaking hesitant through the small windows like it wasn't entirely sure of its welcome. Lena woke to unfamiliar sounds, the snap and hiss of a fire being rebuilt, the clatter of metal against metal, footsteps crossing wooden floorboards with purpose. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Her body tensed for the morning bell that used to signal the start of orphanage routines. Then memory settled back into place. The auction. The stranger. The long ride through wilderness to a cabin that smelled of pine smoke and solitude. She lifted her head carefully, not wanting to wake Mara, who still slept curled tight beneath the blankets. Across the room, Elias moved between hearth and table, building the day's first meal with the same efficient motions he'd used for everything yesterday. He'd already dressed, his hair damp like he'd washed at the creek despite the morning chill. "Sleep through?" he asked without turning, somehow aware she was awake. "Yes." Lena's voice came rough. She cleared her throat. "Sir, Elias, coffee's hot. You drink coffee?" "No." "You will hear. Gets cold enough to freeze spit come December." He poured dark liquid into a tin cup, added what looked like a generous spoon of honey, and carried it to the table. "Milk's from a neighbor's cow 3 miles west. We trade venison for dairy when I've got surplus. Sugar's scarce, but honey works well enough." Lena slipped from beneath the blankets, careful not to disturb her sister, and padded barefoot across the cold floor. The coffee sat steaming in front of the bench where she settled. She wrapped both hands around the cup's warmth, inhaling the bittersweet scent. "Sip slow," Elias advised, returning to the hearth where something was cooking in an iron skillet. "Burns like fury if you rush it." She obeyed, letting the liquid barely touch her lips. It was strong, sweetened, but still carrying an edge that made her eyes water. She couldn't imagine drinking this daily, but she suspected arguing would be pointless. "Eggs and cornbread," Elias announced, sliding food onto 2 wooden plates. "Your sister wake soon?" "Usually, she's an early riser when she feels safe." The words slipped out before Lena could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. Elias paused, spatula in hand, and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over distant mountains. They held something that might have been understanding. "She's safe here?" he asked quietly. Lena wanted to say yes, wanted to offer the reassurance that would smooth over her unintentional honesty. But he'd made that rule about lying, and something in his steady gaze suggested he'd know if she tried. "Don't know yet," she said. He nodded slowly, accepting this. "Fair answer." He brought the plates to the table, setting one in front of her and keeping the other for himself. "Eat. We've got work today." The eggs were cooked in bacon grease, the cornbread dense and filling. Lena ate slowly, her stomach unused to this much food at once. At the orphanage, breakfast had been thin porridge and occasional bread crusts. This felt almost wasteful in its abundance. Behind them, Mara stirred. Lena heard the small sound of distress her sister made upon waking in strange places, the whimper that preceded full panic. She started to rise, but Elias gestured for her to stay seated. "Let her come to you," he said. "She needs to learn the cabin's safe without being carried everywhere." It went against every instinct Lena had developed over 3 years of being Mara's primary protector. But before she could protest, Mara appeared at the edge of the table, rubbing her eyes with small fists, her hair a wild tangle. "Lena?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Here." Lena patted the bench beside her. "Come eat breakfast." Mara climbed up, pressing against her sister's side. Elias had already prepared a 3rd plate, smaller portions, the eggs cut into manageable pieces. He set it down without comment, then returned to his own meal. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against wood and the occasional pop from the fire. It should have been uncomfortable, this absence of conversation, but somehow it wasn't. There was peace in the quiet, and the simple act of sharing food without demands or expectations layered beneath every bite. When the plates were clean, Elias collected them and carried them to a basin near the door. "You'll learn to wash dishes today," he told Lena. "Small hands work better than mine for getting inside cups and bowls." "Yes, sir." "Elias, your sister can help dry. Even 3-year-olds can hold cloth and rub plates." He showed them the system. Heat water at the fire until it steamed, add a scraping of lye soap, scrub each item thoroughly, rinse in clean water from the bucket, dry and stack on the shelf. His hands moved through the process once, demonstrating. Then he stepped back and let Lena try. The water was hot enough to pinken her hands, the soap harsh against skin already roughened by neglect. But the task itself was straightforward, almost meditative. Mara stood beside her with a rag, carefully drying each piece Lena handed over, her small face serious with concentration. "Good," Elias said when they'd finished. "You learn quick. That matters here." He pulled on a heavy coat that hung by the door and gestured for them to follow. Outside, the morning had brightened somewhat, though clouds still hung low and threatening. The air tasted of coming rain, sharp and electric. "Garden first," Elias announced, leading them around the cabin's north side. "Harvest's mostly done, but there's still squash that needs picking and bean plants to pull before frost kills them completely." The garden was larger than Lena had realized, perhaps 30 feet square, surrounded by a fence that showed signs of constant repair. Rabbit wire had been woven through the lower rails, and scarecrows made from old shirts stuffed with straw stood sentinel at corners. "Deer?" Elias explained, following her gaze to the elaborate fencing. "They'll eat everything if you let them. Rabbits, too. Even with protection, I lose a third of what I plant." He handed Lena a woven basket and showed her which squash were ready, firm-skinned, heavy for their size, stems dried and brown. Mara followed, picking up smaller vegetables that Lena passed to her, creating a careful pile by the garden gate. "Winter's coming early this year," Elias said, working alongside them. "Can feel it in how the animals are behaving. Squirrels gathering harder than usual, birds already heading south. When you live out here, you learn to read those signs." "How long have you lived here?" Lena asked, then worried she'd overstepped. But Elias seemed willing to answer. 7 years, built the cabin myself first year, nearly died that winter because I didn't know what I was doing. Learned better after that." He pulled a particularly large squash free from withered vines. "This land doesn't forgive ignorance, but it's honest about what it expects." They worked through the morning, harvesting what remained of summer's growth. Elias talked while they worked, not constant chatter, but occasional comments about weather patterns, soil quality, which plants grew best at this elevation. Lena absorbed the information hungrily, understanding that survival here would require knowledge she didn't yet possess. When the basket was full and the garden stripped of everything edible, they carried their harvest back to the cabin. Elias showed them the root cellar, a deep hole dug beneath the floor and accessed through a trap door near the hearth. Cool air rose from below, carrying the earthy scent of stored vegetables. "Keeps things from freezing in winter, stays cool enough in summer to prevent rot," he explained, climbing down the ladder. "You'll spend time down here throughout cold months, checking for spoilage and bringing up what we need daily." He organized the squash carefully, setting each one on rough shelving with space between so air could circulate. When he emerged, his hands were dirty, but his expression satisfied. "That's stored. Now we process beans." The next hours passed in repetitive labor, shelling dried beans from their pods, sorting good from damaged, storing the harvest in sealed jars that lined cabin shelves. Mara fell asleep halfway through, curled on the bed with her thumb in her mouth. Lena's fingers cramped from the precise work, but she didn't complain. "You're stronger than you look," Elias observed, watching her work through another pile without pause. "Had to be." "The orphanage?" He asked it carefully, giving her space to refuse the question. "And before. My mother worked in a textile mill. She'd bring home piecework and I'd help when I was old enough to hold a needle." Lena's hands continued their rhythm, muscle memory taking over. "She died when I was 6, lung fever from the factory air." "And Mara's parents?" "Don't know. She was left at the orphanage as a baby. They kept looking for family, but nobody ever came." Lena glanced at her sleeping sister. "I used to tell her stories about parents who loved her but couldn't keep her. Don't know if that was kindness or just lying." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his own hands steady in their work. Sometimes the stories we tell aren't about truth. They're about survival. Nothing wrong with that. By midday, the beans were stored and lunch was a simple affair. Leftover cornbread with butter and jam made from wild berries. Mara woke hungry and disoriented, calming only when Lena held her close and murmured reassurance. "She always this quiet?" Elias asked, noting how the little girl hadn't spoken all morning. "She used to talk more. Full sentences, questions about everything." Lena stroked her sister's tangled hair. "Then we got put on the wagons, and something just stopped. She hasn't said more than a few words since. Trauma does that. Seen it in animals. They shut down when the world gets too big and too frightening." He studied Mara with clinical interest. "She'll talk again when she feels safer. Might take time." "We have time?" Lena asked, unable to keep the desperate hope from her voice. Elias met her eyes. "I didn't buy you planning to return you. If I'd wanted temporary labor, I'd have hired adults from town. You're here unless you choose to leave or unless you do something so dangerous it threatens all our lives. Clear?" "Yes." "Good. Now finish eating. Afternoons for building." After lunch, Elias led them outside to a stand of young pines at the clearing's edge. He carried an axe, its blade worn but sharp, and gestured to several trees he'd clearly marked previously. "Your bed," he announced, "needs to be sturdy enough for two, wide enough you're not falling out nightly. I'll cut and shape. You'll help carry and sand." Lena watched him work, impressed despite herself. He moved with confidence born from years of solitary survival, each axe stroke precise and controlled. The first tree fell with a crack that sent birds scattering from nearby branches. He trimmed it quickly, removing smaller growth until only the straight trunk remained. "Grab the other end," he instructed. Together they carried the log back to the cabin's clearing, Lena straining under weight that Elias managed with apparent ease. Mara followed, her attention caught by the spectacle of a tree being transformed into something useful. By the time the sun began its western descent, Elias had felled and trimmed 4 suitable logs. He showed Lena how to use rough stones to sand away bark and splinters, how to test wood for weak spots that might break under pressure. Her hands were raw by the time he called the work finished for the day, but the bed's basic frame was taking shape, a simple rectangle that would sit low to the floor but provide far more space than sharing his single bed allowed. "Tomorrow we'll finish it," Elias said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cooling air. "Add slats for support, stuff a mattress with whatever dried grass and moss we can gather. Won't be fancy, but it'll keep you off the floor." "It's more than enough," Lena said quietly. He nodded, accepting this, and headed inside to start supper preparations. Lena lingered in the clearing with Mara, watching the sky deepen through shades of copper and violet. The forest around them held sounds she was still learning, wind through pine needles, the distant call of some bird she couldn't name, the creek's constant murmur over stones. "Lena?" Mara's voice was so soft it almost disappeared into the evening air. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Are we staying?" The question held more weight than 3 words should carry. Lena knelt so their eyes were level, taking her sister's small hands in her own roughened ones. "I think so. I think maybe we are." "He's not mean," Mara observed, with a child's simple assessment. "No, he's not mean. The lady at the orphanage said men who live alone are dangerous." Lena thought about this, about Elias's careful distance, his matter-of-fact instruction, the way he'd given them his bed without expecting gratitude or servitude in return. "I don't think he's dangerous. Just private. And maybe lonely, though he'd probably never say so." "Are you scared?" Mara asked. "A little, but less than yesterday." Lena stood, tugging her sister toward the cabin. "Come on, let's see if we can help with supper." Inside, Elias had begun preparing what looked like stew, chunks of venison simmering with root vegetables in a pot that hung over the fire. The cabin smelled of cooking meat and wood smoke, warmth pushing back the evening chill that crept through every crack. "Can I help?" Lena offered. Elias glanced at her, then at Mara hovering near the door. "You can set the table. Bowls on the 3rd shelf, spoons in the drawer beneath. Your sister can put out cups, not the ceramic ones, just the tin. Ceramic breaks too easy in small hands." They worked in the now familiar quiet, each person focused on their task. When the stew was ready, they sat and ate as the last light faded from the windows and the fire became the cabin's primary illumination. The meal was good, better than anything they'd been served in months. "Tomorrow's town day," Elias announced as they finished eating. "Need to arrange some things, get supplies I couldn't carry with 2 extra passengers on the ride home. You'll both come." "To Red Hollow?" Lena's voice came tight with anxiety. "No. Different town, smaller. Place called Timber Ridge, about 2 hours south. Less judgment there, people mind their own business better." He collected the empty bowls. "You'll need proper clothes before winter. What you're wearing won't survive the first real snow." Lena looked down at her threadbare dress, at Mara's equally worn clothing. She hadn't thought about winter, about what survival in this isolated place would require beyond the work already assigned. "We can pay for it," she said carefully. "With work. Extra chores or—" "You're already working," Elias interrupted. "Clothes are necessity, not luxury. I should have thought of it yesterday, but I wasn't planning ahead." He rinsed bowls in the washing basin. "We'll get what's needed. You can repay me by not freezing to death and requiring burial in frozen ground." It might have been a joke. With Elias, it was hard to tell. His expression remained neutral, but Lena thought she detected the faintest trace of humor around his eyes. That night, after Mara had fallen asleep in the big bed and Lena lay listening to the fire's diminishing crackle, Elias spoke from his blankets near the hearth. "The people in town will ask questions tomorrow about why I have children suddenly. How I'll answer depends on what you want them to know." Lena considered this. "What are the options?" "Truth. You were bought at auction. I'm providing room and board in exchange for work assistance. Makes it clear you're not indentured beyond standard arrangement." He paused. "Or simpler version, you're orphans I'm taking in temporarily until better placement is found. That satisfies curiosity without inviting judgment. Which brings less trouble. For you? Probably the simpler version. People see children working for keep, they don't question much. They see children who might be permanent additions. They start wondering about propriety and legal arrangements. Then say we're temporary," Lena decided. "At least until we know if staying is actually possible." "Smart choice." Elias shifted in his blankets, settling. "But understand, temporary or not, while you're here, you follow my lead in town. Don't contradict anything I say. Don't volunteer information people don't need. Small towns survive on gossip, and gossip can turn dangerous faster than weather. We'll be careful." "I know you will. You're careful by nature. Learned that much already." His voice had gone quieter, touched with something that might have been approval. "Sleep now. Tomorrow's going to be long." Lena closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her down into restless sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to navigate, new ways to prove they were worth keeping. But tonight, at least, they had a roof overhead and food in their bellies and each other close enough to touch. It was more than yesterday had promised. In a life where tomorrow was never guaranteed, that had to be enough. The next morning dawned clearer, the threatening clouds from yesterday having moved on to trouble some other territory. Elias woke them before dawn, the cabin still dark except for the rebuilt fire's glow. He'd already been outside. His boots were wet with dew, and he smelled of pine and morning cold. "Quick breakfast," he announced. "We leave within the hour." They ate standing up, leftover cornbread and dried apple slices, washed down with water cold enough to make teeth ache. Mara was more alert this morning, her eyes tracking Elias's movements with curiosity rather than fear. She still hadn't spoken beyond that one question last evening, but something in her posture suggested she was beginning to relax into this strange new reality. Elias saddled the horse while Lena helped Mara into the cleanest clothes they possessed, which wasn't saying much. Their dresses were stained beyond remedy, fabric worn thin at seams and elbows. They looked exactly like what they were, orphans with nothing, dependent on the mercy of whoever would claim them. "Don't worry about appearances," Elias said when he noticed Lena trying to smooth wrinkles from her skirt. "That's part of why we're going to town. By tomorrow you'll have clothes that fit and boots that don't have holes." The ride to Timber Ridge followed a different trail than the one they'd taken from Red Hollow, this one cutting south through denser forest and along ridge lines that offered occasional views of valleys below. The morning warmed gradually, sunlight filtering through pine canopy and dusty shafts. Elias rode with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything, his attention on the trail, but his posture relaxed. Lena, sandwiched between him and Mara, found herself noticing small details. The way he automatically adjusted their position when the horse navigated tricky footing, how he slowed at creek crossings to let the animal drink, the low sounds he made that seemed to communicate with the horse without need for words. "You're good with animals," she observed. "Animals are honest. They don't pretend to feel things they don't, and they don't judge beyond what's useful for survival." He guided the horse around a fallen log. "People could learn from that. You don't like people much." "I like them fine. Just prefer them in small doses and with clear purposes." He shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Present company excluded. You two don't count as people yet." "What do we count as?" Lena asked, uncertain whether to be offended. "Not sure. Still figuring that out." They rode in silence after that, Lena mulling over his words and finding them oddly comforting. At least he was honest about not knowing what they meant to him. That was better than false promises or manufactured affection. Timber Ridge appeared gradually, the forest thinning to reveal a town considerably smaller than Red Hollow. Perhaps 20 buildings lined a single main street, general store, blacksmith, what looked like a church, several houses, and a building marked with a hand-painted sign that read Doctor and Legal Services. Elias rode directly to the general store, dismounting and tying the horse to a hitching post worn smooth by years of use. He helped the girls down, then paused before entering, his expression serious. "Remember what I said. Follow my lead. Don't volunteer information. If someone asks you direct questions, answer briefly and politely. Clear?" "Clear," Lena confirmed. The store's interior was dim and crowded with merchandise, barrels of flour and sugar, shelves lined with canned goods, farm tools hanging from ceiling hooks, bolts of fabric stacked against the far wall. Behind the counter stood a woman in her middle years, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that missed nothing. "Elias Crow," she said by way of greeting. "Haven't seen you in near 2 months. Thought maybe you'd finally gone full hermit and died up there in your cabin." "Not yet, Martha." Elias approached the counter, removing his hat. "Need supplies. The usual staples plus fabric and thread. Enough for children's winter clothing." Martha's attention shifted to Lena and Mara, her gaze assessing without being unkind. "Children. That's new. Temporary situation. Their parents died, and I'm keeping them until better arrangement can be found." The lie came smooth, practiced, as if Elias had been preparing it. "Meanwhile, they need clothes that won't fall apart in the first snow." "Sensible." Martha came around the counter, circling the girls with a merchant's calculating eye. "How much can you sew?" she asked Lena directly. "Basic mending, simple seams, nothing fancy." "Good enough. I'll sell you muslin for undergarments and sturdy wool for outer layers. You'll have to cut and sew yourself. I'm not a seamstress." She pulled bolts of fabric from the stack, selecting practical colors: browns, dark greens, gray. "This should hold up through winter if the stitching's decent." Elias nodded approval. "Add needles, strong thread, and buttons to the order." "You'll need boots too," Martha observed, glancing at their worn shoes. "Cobbler's 3 doors down. Tell him I sent you, and he'll give fair price." While Martha assembled their order, measuring fabric and wrapping purchases in brown paper, other customers filtered through the store. Most ignored the small group at the counter, focused on their own needs. But one man, tall and weathered, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest, paused in his browsing to study them with professional interest. "Crow," he greeted, his tone neutral but watchful. "Those children yours?" "Temporarily," Elias replied, not elaborating. "Temporarily." The marshal repeated the word like he was tasting it for hidden meanings. "They got names?" "Lena and Mara." "They got voices?" Elias's expression didn't change, but Lena felt tension radiating from him like heat from sun-baked stone. "They speak when spoken to directly. Right now, they're listening to adults conduct business." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly. "Just making sure everything's proper. Territory's got rules about children, especially ones without clear parentage." Everything's proper, Elias said quietly. I'm providing care until permanent placement is arranged. That satisfy your concern? For now. The marshal tipped his hat to Martha and left, but his departure felt more like postponement than dismissal. Martha handed over the wrapped parcels, her expression sympathetic. Don't mind Thomas, he's suspicious by nature. Comes with the badge. But he's also fair. If your situation's legitimate, he won't make trouble. And if he decides it's not legitimate? Elias counted out coins for the purchase. Then you'll deal with questions. Best be prepared with answers. She accepted the payment, then added quietly, For what it's worth, those girls look better than most orphans I've seen. Whatever you're doing, it's not harming them. Wasn't planning to harm them. I know. But intentions and actions don't always match. Martha's gaze softened slightly. If you need advice on caring for children, on managing 2 girls in particular, my sister raised 4 daughters alone after her husband died. She'd be willing to talk, if you wanted perspective. I'll manage. I'm sure you will. But the offer stands. She handed him a piece of paper with an address written in careful script. Just in case managing gets complicated. They left the store with their parcels and headed to the cobbler, where a bent old man with gnarled hands measured their feet and promised boots ready within a week. Elias arranged to pick them up on his next trip to town, paying a deposit that made Lena's stomach clench with guilt over money spent on their behalf. Their final stop was the building marked for legal services. Elias entered alone, instructing the girls to wait outside with the parcels. Through the window, Lena watched him speak with a thin man in spectacles, their conversation serious and involving papers that the man pulled from a cluttered desk. When Elias emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral. Done, he said simply, collecting their packages. Let's head back. The ride home felt longer than the journey to town, though the sun's position said otherwise. Mara fell asleep against Lena's shoulder, lulled by the horse's steady rhythm and the morning's overwhelming newness. Lena stayed alert, her mind turning over the interactions in town. Martha's calculated kindness, the marshal's suspicious questions, Elias's careful answers that revealed nothing unnecessary. What did you do at the legal office? She asked finally, unable to contain her curiosity. Elias was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, filed paperwork, temporary guardianship documentation, in case anyone questions my right to keep you. Makes everything legitimate in the eyes of territorial law. So we're legal now? For 6 months. After that, I have to either renew the guardianship, find you permanent placement, or demonstrate that you've been claimed by family. His voice remained even, factual. It's protection. For you and for me. Means the marshal can't just decide I'm doing something improper and take you away without cause. Lena absorbed this, understanding the weight of what he'd done. Legal guardianship, even temporary, meant responsibility. It meant he couldn't simply return them if they became inconvenient. Why go through that trouble? Because I said you could stay, and I meant it. He guided the horse around a rough patch of trail. But meaning it isn't enough in territory with laws and officials who think they know better than lived experience. So I made it official. Now there's paper saying what I already decided. They rode the rest of the way in silence, arriving at the cabin as afternoon shadows grew long. Elias helped them down, then began unloading their purchases while Lena carried the still sleeping Mara inside. The little girl had gained weight in just 2 days of regular meals, her face less gaunt, her body feeling more substantial. That night, working by firelight after supper, Elias showed Lena how to cut fabric using careful measurements, how to piece together simple garments that would serve function over fashion. His hands were surprisingly deft with needle and thread, suggesting skills he'd had to learn through necessity rather than choice. My wife used to do this, he said quietly, demonstrating a particular stitch. I paid attention, though I never thought I'd need to. After she died, I had to learn fast or go without mended clothes. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly. Lena wanted to ask questions, how she'd died, how long they'd been married, whether he missed her still. But the set of his shoulders suggested those questions would be unwelcome, so she focused on learning the stitches he showed her, on creating something useful with her hands. By the time they stopped for the night, Two small shifts were taking shape, undergarments that would provide warmth beneath outer layers. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Lena folded the fabric carefully and placed it on the shelf where supplies were stored, already planning tomorrow's work. Mara had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted by the day's adventures. Lena checked on her before settling into their shared bed, noting how her sister's breathing had finally evened into something peaceful rather than the fitful sleep of constant anxiety. "She's doing better," Elias observed from his blankets near the hearth. "She is," Lena agreed. "Both of us are." "Good." He shifted, getting comfortable. "Tomorrow we finish your bed frame and start gathering moss for the mattress. Following day, we process more of the garden harvest and start preserving meat for winter. Work doesn't stop just because we went to town." "I know." "Do you?" He turned his head to look at her across the darkened cabin. "Because winter here isn't like winter in towns. We get snowed in for weeks at a time. If we're not prepared, if every bit of work doesn't get done right, people die. Understand?" "I understand," Lena said, and meant it. "We won't let you down." "Didn't think you would." His voice had gone softer, almost gentle. "But I needed to say it anyway. So there's no confusion when I push you harder than might seem fair. We can handle hard." "I believe you can." He settled back into his blankets. "Now, sleep. Tomorrow starts early, same as always." Lena closed her eyes, letting the day's tensions finally release. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more tests of whether they could truly survive in this isolated place. But tonight, they had shelter and safety and the beginning of something that might eventually feel like belonging. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The promised early start came before dawn had properly broken, gray light barely touching the horizon when Elias shook Lena awake. The cabin held the deep chill of October mornings in high country, cold enough that her breath misted when she sat up and reached for the blanket to wrap around her shoulders. "Frost last night," Elias said, already dressed and moving toward the door. "First real one of the season. Means we're behind on winter preparations." Lena dressed quickly in the dim light, pulling on her worn dress and the thin shawl that did little against the cold. Beside her, Mara stirred but didn't wake, still curled tight beneath the heavy blankets. Elias had banked the fire before sleeping, and now he rebuilt it with quick efficiency, coaxing flame from embers until warmth began pushing back the morning chill. "Let her sleep another hour," he said, nodding toward Mara. "We'll work better without worrying about a 3-year-old underfoot." Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Ice crystals coated every surface, turning grass into fields of silver needles and making the trees glitter like they'd been dusted with ground glass. The beauty was striking and terrifying all at once, a reminder that nature here didn't care about human comfort or survival. Elias led her to the woodpile behind the cabin, where split logs stood stacked in neat rows beneath a rough shelter. "Not enough," he said flatly, surveying the supply. "We need 3 times this much to make it through winter without rationing. That means cutting every day until snow makes it impossible." He handed her a pair of worn leather gloves, too large for her hands, but better than nothing against splinters and cold. "Your job is stacking. I'll cut and split, you carry and arrange. Stack tight. No gaps where wind can get through. We're building walls against cold, and sloppy work means frozen nights." The work began immediately, Elias swinging the axe with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Each strike was precise, controlled, the blade biting deep into seasoned wood. Lena hauled the split pieces to the woodpile, her arms aching within the first hour, but her jaw set against complaint. He'd said the work would be hard. Proving she could handle it mattered more than comfort. They worked through the morning without pause, the sun climbing higher but providing little warmth. By the time Elias called a break, Lena's hands were blistered inside the gloves, her back protesting every movement. But the woodpile had grown noticeably, new rows adding height and depth to what had been there before. "Good work," Elias said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "You didn't complain once." "Complaining doesn't change what needs doing." "No, it doesn't." He studied her with that considering expression she was learning to recognize. "But most people complain anyway. Shows character that you don't." Inside, Mara was awake and had somehow managed to build up the fire on her own, adding logs from the small stack kept near the hearth. She looked proud of this accomplishment, her face brightening when Lena praised her initiative. "Smart girl," Elias agreed, examining the fire to ensure it was safe. "Tomorrow I'll teach you both how to bank embers properly so the cabin stays warm through the night. Can't afford to let fires die completely. Rekindling from nothing wastes time and fuel." Breakfast was quick and functional: oatmeal cooked with dried berries and a splash of honey, strong coffee for the adults, and milk for Mara. They ate standing at the counter rather than sitting, Elias already mentally moving to the next task. "Mattress next," he announced. "Needs moss, dried grass, whatever we can gather that's clean and dry. Then we sew it into a tick and stuff it full. With both of you working, should have it done by nightfall." They spent the afternoon ranging through the forest near the cabin, gathering armfuls of moss that grew thick on the north sides of trees, and collecting bundles of grass from clearings where summer growth had dried into pale gold stalks. Mara proved surprisingly useful at this task, her small hands able to reach into crevices and pull free moss that the adults couldn't access easily. "Good eyes," Elias told her after she pointed out a particularly lush patch growing beneath a fallen log. "You're learning to see what's useful instead of just what's pretty." Mara smiled at the praise but still didn't speak, her silence now familiar enough that nobody pressed. She communicated through gestures and expressions, through the careful way she sorted moss into piles based on quality, separating the cleanest specimens from those contaminated with dirt or bark. By late afternoon, they'd gathered enough material to fill the mattress tick that Elias had sewn from rough canvas the night before. The stuffing process was harder than Lena expected, requiring them to pack the materials tight enough to provide cushioning, but not so dense that the mattress became rigid and uncomfortable. "Has to breathe," Elias explained, demonstrating the proper technique. "Too tight, and you'll sweat through your clothes every night. Too loose, and you'll feel every board beneath. Finding the right balance takes practice." They worked together, Lena and Elias stuffing while Mara fetched more material from the piles they'd made. The cabin filled with the scent of dried grass and forest floor, earthy and clean. When the mattress was finally full and sewn shut, Elias lifted it onto the bed frame he'd finished that morning and stepped back to assess. "Not fancy, but it'll do," he said. "Better than sleeping on bare boards anyway." That night, after supper had been eaten and dishes washed, Lena and Mara lay on their new bed, testing its comfort. The mattress was lumpy in places, uneven where the stuffing hadn't distributed perfectly, but it was soft and it smelled of the forest, and it was theirs. Mara curled against her sister's side, one small hand fisted in Lena's dress, and for the first time since leaving the orphanage, she looked genuinely peaceful. "Thank you," Lena said quietly, the words directed at Elias, where he sat by the fire mending a leather harness. He glanced up, needle pausing mid-stitch. "For what?" "The bed. The clothes we're making. All of it." She struggled to articulate the feeling. "You didn't have to do any of this." "Yes, I did." He returned to his work, voice matter of fact. "Said I'd keep you fed and housed. That means providing basics, not just letting you exist barely. There's a difference." Most people don't see the difference. Most people are satisfied with minimum effort. He pulled thread tight, testing the strength of his repair. "I'm not most people." The days that followed fell into demanding rhythm. Morning came early, breakfast was quick, and work consumed every daylight hour. Elias drove them hard, but never cruelly, his expectations high, but his instructions clear. He taught them to recognize which trees were dead enough for safe cutting, how to split wood along the grain for maximum efficiency, the proper way to stack supplies so nothing rotted or was damaged by moisture. Lena absorbed the lessons desperately, understanding that this knowledge meant survival. She learned to read weather signs, the way birds behaved before storms, how clouds moving in particular patterns predicted rain or snow, the smell of the air when temperature was about to drop sharply. She learned which plants were safe to handle and which caused rashes, how to preserve meat using salt and smoke, the careful rationing required to make supplies stretch through months of isolation. Mara learned too, in her quiet way. She mastered the art of feeding chickens that Elias kept in a small coop behind the cabin, learned to collect eggs without breaking them, discovered which herbs growing near the garden could be dried for winter cooking. Her silence continued, but her competence grew daily, her small hands becoming skilled at tasks that required patience and precision. 3 weeks after their arrival, the first real storm hit. It came without much warning, clouds rolling in fast from the north and bringing wind that bent trees and sent loose items flying across the clearing. Elias had just enough time to secure the livestock and double-check that everything essential was under shelter before the rain started. Cold, driving sheets that turned the world gray and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Inside the cabin, they huddled near the fire while wind howled around the walls and rain hammered against the roof. Water found its way through tiny gaps in the chinking, creating small puddles that Lena mopped up repeatedly. Thunder cracked close enough to rattle the windows, and Mara finally broke her weeks-long silence with a small sound of fear. "Storms can't hurt us in here," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Cabin's solid. I built it to withstand worse than this." "How much worse?" Lena asked, trying to keep her own fear from showing for Mara's sake. "Winter storms with snow so deep you can't see the windows. Wind that knocks full-grown trees down like they're nothing. Cold that'll kill you in minutes if you're caught outside unprepared." He added another log to the fire, building up heat against the chill seeping through walls. "This is just rain. Rain's easy." The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, finally breaking apart by mid-afternoon to reveal a world washed clean but deeply changed. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and ice had formed at the edges of puddles. Several trees had come down at the clearing's edge, their roots torn free from earth softened by water. One had fallen across the trail leading away from the cabin, effectively blocking the only easy route to town. "That's going to be a problem," Elias said, surveying the damage. "Can't move a tree that size alone, and I can't leave it blocking the trail all winter." "When's your next supply trip?" Lena asked. "Was supposed to be next week. Pick up those boots we ordered, get flour and salt before snow makes travel impossible." He walked around the fallen tree, assessing. "Might have to go sooner. Clear this with help from town before the ground freezes solid." 2 days later, he made the decision. "I'm riding to Timber Ridge tomorrow. Be gone overnight. Weather's too uncertain to risk the return trip after dark. You two will stay here, keep the fire going, don't open the door to anyone except me." Lena felt fear spike cold in her chest. What if something happens? What if someone comes? Nobody comes out here. That's the point of living this far from town. He was packing supplies into saddlebags as he spoke, his movements efficient. But if someone does show up, you don't answer. Don't make noise. Don't show light after dark. Wait until they leave, then wait longer to be sure. And if they don't leave? Elias paused, then walked to the corner where he kept his rifle. He checked it carefully, ensuring it was unloaded, then showed Lena how to load and fire it. "This is a last resort. You use it only if someone's trying to break in and you have no other option. Understand?" "Yes." "The recoil will knock you flat if you're not braced properly. Aim for the body. Biggest target, hardest to miss. Don't try for anything fancy." He made her practice the motions until she could load the rifle smoothly, until her hands remembered the sequence without thinking. "You'll probably never need this knowledge, but probably isn't certain, and certain is what keeps people alive." He left at dawn the next morning, riding out on the bay gelding with promises to return by the following evening. Lena watched him disappear down the trail, then closed the cabin door and secured it with the heavy bar Elias had shown her how to use. The day passed slowly, filled with small tasks that did little to occupy her anxious mind. She and Mara worked on sewing projects, continued cutting fabric for the winter clothes they were making, prepared simple meals, and kept the fire burning steady. Every sound from outside made Lena's heart jump, wind through pines, branches scraping against the cabin walls, the distant call of birds or animals she couldn't identify. Night fell early and complete. Darkness so absolute that Lena understood for the first time what true isolation meant. They were alone in wilderness with no neighbors within shouting distance, no help available if something went wrong. The responsibility of keeping Mara safe, of maintaining the fire in the cabin in Elias's absence felt crushing. "Tell me a story," Mara whispered, the first full sentence she'd spoken since before the auction. Lena looked at her sister in surprise, then gathered her close. "What kind of story?" "A safe one." So Lena told stories until her voice went hoarse. Tales of brave children who survived impossible odds, of kindness found in unexpected places, of homes that welcomed the lost and gave them belonging. Mara listened with fierce attention, and when sleep finally claimed her, she wore the smallest smile. Lena stayed awake long after, sitting near the fire with the rifle close at hand, listening to the night sounds of the forest and praying that Elias would return as promised. The cabin felt both too large and too small all at once, filled with shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to find dawn breaking gray and cold through the windows. The fire had burned low but not out, and Mara still slept peacefully. Lena rebuilt the flames and started preparing breakfast, trying to ignore the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. Elias had said he'd return by evening. Evening was still hours away. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Lena kept herself and Mara busy with chores, with sewing, with anything that would make time move faster. She checked the trail repeatedly, watching for any sign of horse and rider. As afternoon shadows lengthened and still no Elias appeared, her worry transformed into something closer to panic. What if he'd been injured? What if the tree blocking the trail had caused an accident? What if he'd decided that caring for 2 children was more trouble than he'd anticipated and simply wasn't coming back? "He'll come," Mara said quietly, seeming to read her sister's thoughts. "He promised." "Promises break sometimes, sweetheart." "Not his." Mara spoke with the absolute certainty of a child who'd found someone worth trusting. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." As if summoned by her faith, the sound of hoofbeats reached them just as the sun touched the horizon. Lena rushed to the window and saw Elias riding into the clearing, the horse moving slower than usual, but both of them intact. Relief flooded through her so intensely she had to grip the windowsill for support. He dismounted stiffly, clearly exhausted, and began unloading supplies from the saddlebags. Lena unbarred the door and stepped out to help. Mara closed behind her. "Everything all right here?" Elias asked, his eyes scanning the cabin and grounds for signs of trouble. "Fine. Quiet." Lena took one of the heavy bags he handed her. "You?" "Tired. Got the boots. Arranged help for the tree tomorrow. Picked up extra supplies since I was there." He led the horse toward the corral, his movement showing the strain of hard riding. Storm damage was worse in town. Several buildings lost roofs, flooding in the low areas. Could have been us if the cabin wasn't built properly. Inside, they unpacked the supplies while Elias collapsed into the chair near the fire, accepting the coffee Lena prepared without comment. The new boots fit well, sturdy leather that would last through multiple winters if properly maintained. There was extra flour, salt, sugar, coffee, and several items Lena hadn't expected. Candy sticks for Mara, a simple book of children's tales, fabric in colors brighter than the practical browns and grays they'd been working with. "Thought the girl might like something besides work clothes," Elias said, when he noticed Lena examining the brighter fabric. "And the book. Figured you could read to her. Might encourage her to talk more." "She spoke yesterday," Lena said quietly. "Asked for a story." Something shifted in Elias's expression, a softening that was gone almost before it registered. "That's good. That's progress. She said you'd come back because you promised." Lena met his eyes. "She trusts you." "Then I'd better not give her reason to stop." He finished his coffee and stood with visible effort. "I need to tend the horse, then sleep. Tomorrow men from town arrive mid-morning to help clear the trail. You'll both stay inside while they're here. Less questions that way." The next day brought 4 men on horseback, rough-looking individuals who greeted Elias with the casual familiarity of people who'd worked together before. True to his word, Elias kept Lena and Mara inside the cabin while the men labored at the fallen tree, using axes and saws and brute strength to section it into manageable pieces. Through the window, Lena watched them work. Their conversation carried on the wind, though she couldn't make out specific words. Several times, one of the men glanced toward the cabin with obvious curiosity, but Elias seemed to deflect their questions without providing satisfying answers. By late afternoon, the trail was clear. Elias paid the men in coin and in cuts of venison from his stores, sending them on their way with thanks that sounded genuine despite his natural reserve. When they'd gone and silence returned to the clearing, he came inside and found both girls exactly where he'd left them. "Good," he said simply. "You followed instructions." "They were curious," Lena observed. "Of course they were. Strange man living alone suddenly has children. That generates talk." He hung his coat by the door. But talk's just noise unless it turns into action. For now, we're left alone. That's what matters. 3 days after the tree incident, the marshal from Timber Ridge rode into the clearing unannounced. Lena saw him first, recognizing the badge even at a distance, and immediately felt her stomach clench with fear. Elias had been working in the garden, but he straightened when he heard the hoofbeats, his expression going carefully neutral. "Marshal Thomas," he greeted, his tone giving nothing away. "Unexpected visit." "Got questions," the marshal said, dismounting. His eyes found Lena and Mara where they stood frozen by the cabin door. "About your situation here." "My situation's legal. Filed the proper papers, as you well know. Papers say temporary guardianship. Been 6 weeks now. Temporary's starting to look permanent." Thomas walked closer, his attention on the girls. "You two doing all right? He treating you proper?" Lena's mind raced. The wrong answer could mean separation, could mean being taken away from the first stable situation they'd found. But lying would be worse if the marshal sensed deception. "Yes, sir," she said, carefully. "We're fed and clothed and learning useful work. No complaints." "Girl doesn't talk much, does she?" Thomas gestured to Mara, who'd pressed herself against Lena's legs. "She talks when she has something to say," Elias interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Not everyone needs to fill silence with noise." "Defensive about these children, aren't you?" The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Makes a man wonder why." "Makes a man wonder why you're riding 3 hours to question a legal arrangement." Elias crossed his arms. "Something specific concern you, or is this just general suspicion?" "Got a report from someone in town. Said it seemed strange, you taking in children when you've lived alone all these years. Said maybe the arrangement wasn't as innocent as the paperwork suggested." The implication hung heavy in the cold air. Lena felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. She'd seen enough of the world to understand what the marshal was suggesting, and it made her want to scream at the injustice of adults who saw danger in kindness but profit in auctions. "That report's based on gossip, not fact," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "And if you're going to accuse me of impropriety, you'd better have evidence beyond someone's speculation." "I'm not accusing, I'm investigating." Thomas turned his attention back to Lena. "Girl, if something's wrong here, you can tell me. You'll be protected." "Protected?" Lena's voice came sharper than she'd intended. "Like we were protected at the orphanage that ran out of money and shipped us west? Like we were protected standing on an auction block being sold to whoever had coin? This man bought us to keep us together when someone else wanted to separate us. He's fed us every day, taught us how to survive, and treated us with more dignity than any adult has since my mother died. So no, Marshal, nothing's wrong here except people who can't imagine kindness without assuming it hides something ugly." The clearing went silent except for wind through the pines. Thomas stared at her, clearly not expecting such vehemence from a 9-year-old. Beside her, Mara had started crying quietly, overwhelmed by the tension. "Strong opinions for someone so young," Thomas said finally. "Strong experiences teach strong opinions." Lena bent to comfort Mara, done with this conversation. Elias stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the marshal and the girls. "You've done your investigating. You've seen they're healthy and cared for. Unless you have actual cause to remove them, I suggest you head back to town before weather turns." Thomas looked between them for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll be checking in periodically, making sure the situation stays proper. That acceptable to you? Long as you give warning instead of showing up unannounced to harass children." Elias's tone left no room for argument. The marshal mounted his horse, adjusting his hat. "Crow, I hope for all your sakes that your intentions are as pure as the girl says. Because if I find out different, legal paperwork won't protect you. My intentions are survival and basic human decency. If that's not pure enough for you, then your standards need adjusting." Thomas rode out without another word, his departure leaving tension hanging thick in the clearing. Elias stood watching until the marshal disappeared from view, then turned to find Lena trembling with delayed reaction. "That was dangerous," he said quietly. "Speaking to a marshal like that. He was suggesting, I know what he was suggesting, and you defended me with more fire than I deserved." He studied her with that considering look. "But understand, people in positions of authority don't like being challenged, especially not by children. Next time he comes, let me handle the talking. He made me angry. I noticed. Something that might have been approval flickered across his expression, but anger without strategy is just noise. Remember that. That night, after Mara had cried herself into exhausted sleep and the cabin had settled into silence, Lena sat by the fire working on the sewing that never seemed to end. Elias joined her, carrying his own mending, and they worked in comfortable quiet for a while. What you said to the marshal, he finally spoke, not looking up from his work. About dignity and kindness. You meant that? Every word. Why? Lena considered the question carefully. Because you could have bought just me, could have let Mara go to whoever wanted her. But you didn't. And every day since, you've taught us things that make us stronger instead of just using us for whatever work we could provide. That matters. Maybe it shouldn't matter as much as it does, but it's more than we've gotten from anyone else. Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, my wife wanted children desperately. We tried for years, and when she finally got pregnant, we thought all our prayers had been answered. But the baby came too early, and neither of them survived. His hands continued their steady work, muscle memory taking over. After that, I couldn't bear living in town where everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I came here, built this cabin, and convinced myself that solitude was preference instead of grief. What changed? Lena asked softly. You did. Standing on that auction block, refusing to let them take your sister without fighting, reminded me that sometimes the right thing costs more than you plan to spend, but matters more than comfort. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. So yes, I try to treat you with dignity, because you've earned it by being stronger than children should have to be. Lena felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me for honesty. It's the minimum anyone deserves. He returned to his mending. Now finish that hem before the fire burns too low to see properly. Winter clothes need to be ready before winter actually arrives. They worked until the fire dimmed to coals and exhaustion made continued stitching impossible. As Lena prepared for bed, she glanced at Elias settling into his blankets near the hearth and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the tentative beginning of feeling home. Winter arrived in earnest 2 weeks after the marshal's visit, sweeping down from the mountains with winds that stripped the last leaves from aspens and coated everything in a layer of frost that didn't melt even at midday. The world transformed into something both beautiful and hostile, the forest going silent except for the occasional crack of branches weighted down by ice. Inside the cabin, they'd settled into rhythms that felt almost natural now. Mornings began in darkness, with the fire being rebuilt, breakfast prepared while water heated for washing. Lena and Mara had finished their winter clothes, simple dresses layered over thick undergarments, woolen stockings that reached their knees, and the sturdy boots that had finally broken in enough to walk without blisters. They looked like different children than the ones who'd stood on the auction block, healthier and stronger, their faces filled out from consistent meals. Elias had grown accustomed to their presence in ways that showed in small details. He'd carved a second set of pegs by the door for their coats, built a stool so Mara could reach the wash basin without help, started automatically setting 3 places at the table instead of 1. He still spoke sparingly and kept his own counsel on most matters, but the quality of his silence had changed from isolation to companionship. "Snow's coming," he announced one morning, studying the sky through the window. "Real snow, not just these light dustings. We'll be snowed in for at least a week once it starts, maybe longer. Need to make sure everything's secured." They spent the day in frantic preparation, bringing extra wood close to the cabin door, checking that the livestock had sufficient feed and shelter, securing anything outside that might blow away or get buried. Elias moved with controlled urgency, his experience telling him exactly how bad the coming storm would be. By evening, the first flakes began to fall. They came down soft and deceptively gentle, drifting through the air like scattered thoughts. But within an hour, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a driving blizzard, wind screaming around the cabin walls and visibility reduced to nothing but white chaos. "Don't be frightened," Elias told Mara, who'd pressed herself against the window watching the storm with wide eyes. "Cabin's built for this. We're safe as long as we stay inside and keep warm. The storm raged for 3 days straight, snow piling against the cabin walls until the windows on the north side were completely covered. The world outside ceased to exist beyond the reach of firelight, reduced to the howl of wind and the constant whisper of snow against wood. They were trapped in a small circle of warmth and light, isolated not just from town, but from everything beyond the cabin's four walls. Lena discovered that being snowed in was both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier because the forced confinement meant no outdoor work, no dawn wake-ups for woodcutting or garden tending. Harder because the close quarters meant there was nowhere to escape when tensions rose, or when the walls seemed to press inward with the weight of all that accumulated snow. "Read to us," Mara asked on the second day, handing Lena the book of children's tales that Elias had bought in town. So Lena read, her voice filling the cabin with stories of adventure and magic, of children who found their way through dark forests and discovered treasures beyond imagining. Elias listened while he worked on mending harnesses and sharpening tools, his expression neutral, but his attention clearly caught by the narratives. When Lena's voice grew tired, Mara surprised them both by asking, "Can you tell one, Elias?" He looked up from his work, clearly caught off guard. "I'm not much for storytelling." "Please?" Mara's voice carried the kind of hope that was difficult to refuse. Elias set aside his tools, considering. Then he began to speak, his voice lower and rougher than Lena's, but carrying its own weight. He told them about the mountains in winter, about animals that survived through cold that would kill humans in hours, about the resilience required to endure when everything around you wanted you dead. His stories weren't comforting fairy tales, but truths about survival, about reading the land and understanding your place in it. "My father taught me most of this," he said, finishing a description of how to find water in winter when everything was frozen. He was a trapper, spent more time in wilderness than civilization. Some people thought he was crazy for choosing that life, but he understood something most don't. That hard living makes you appreciate what you have instead of always wanting more. "What happened to him?" Lena asked. "Died when I was 15, caught in an avalanche while checking his trapline." Elias's voice remained steady, factual. "They found his body that spring when the snow melted. By then I'd already left, couldn't bear staying in the cabin we'd shared knowing he wouldn't be coming back." "I'm sorry," Lena said softly. "It was his choice to live that way. He knew the risks." Elias picked up his work again. "But he taught me everything I needed to survive alone. That was his gift, even if he didn't live long enough to see me use it." The conversation settled into comfortable silence after that, each person lost in their own thoughts, while the storm continued its assault outside. That night, as Lena and Mara lay in their bed listening to wind scream past the walls, Mara whispered a question. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Lena stroked her sister's hair, considering how to answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. The guardianship papers are only for 6 months. But after that?" "After that, I suppose it depends on whether Elias wants us to stay and whether the law allows it." She pulled the blankets higher, tucking them around Mara's small form. "Would you want to stay? If we could?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "I like it here. I like him. He's not mean like the people at the orphanage, and he doesn't look at us like we're burdens." "No," Lena agreed quietly. "He doesn't." "Do you think he likes having us here?" Lena thought about Elias's careful teaching, his patience when they made mistakes, the way he defended them to the marshal without expecting gratitude in return. "I think he's getting used to us. That's probably the best we can hope for right now." The storm finally broke on the 4th day, the wind dying to nothing and the snow tapering off until individual flakes could be tracked with the eye. When Elias opened the cabin door, they confronted a world completely transformed. Snow had drifted as high as the roof in some places, burying familiar landmarks and turning the clearing into an alien landscape of white on white. 4 feet at least, Elias assessed, studying the drifts. Maybe 5 in the deeper sections. We'll need to dig paths to the woodpile, the livestock, the outhouse. That's going to take most of the day. He'd carved rough snow shovels from wood the previous winter, and now he handed the smaller one to Lena while keeping the larger for himself. "Start with the path to the outhouse. That's priority. Clear it wide enough for easy passage and pile the snow on the sides where it won't drift back. I'll work on reaching the livestock." The work was brutal, each shovelful of snow heavier than it looked, the cold biting through their clothes despite the layers. Within an hour, Lena's arms were shaking with exhaustion, but she kept digging, understanding that this wasn't optional labor. Without clear paths, they couldn't function. Without access to supplies, they couldn't survive. Mara helped in her limited way, using a smaller piece of wood to push snow aside in areas where the drifts weren't as deep. She worked seriously, her small face set with determination, occasionally pausing to catch her breath in the thin, cold air. By late afternoon, they'd cleared the essential paths, though Elias made it clear this was only the beginning. Snow will drift again with the next wind. We'll be digging out regularly until spring. It's just part of living here. That evening, exhausted and aching, they gathered around the fire for supper. Elias had prepared a stew from preserved vegetables and salted meat, thick and filling, designed to restore energy spent fighting the snow. They ate in hungry silence, too tired for conversation. "You both did good work today," Elias said when the meal was finished. "Better than I expected for your first real dig-out." "How many more storms like that will there be?" Lena asked. "4, maybe 5 before spring, some worse than this one." He leaned back in his chair, studying them. "I won't lie and say it gets easier, but you learn what to expect, and that makes the next one more manageable." 2 weeks after the first major storm, Marshal Thomas returned. They heard his horse struggling through the snowpacked trail long before he came into view, the animal laboring with each step through drifts that hadn't been cleared beyond Elias's immediate property. "Persistent man," Elias muttered, watching through the window. "Must really think he's going to find something wrong here." Thomas looked half frozen when he finally reached the cabin, his face reddened by cold and his coat crusted with ice. Elias led him inside with obvious reluctance, gesturing toward the fire. "Warm yourself before you freeze to death. Can't answer questions if your jaw's locked from cold." The marshal accepted the coffee Lena prepared without comment, wrapping his hands around the cup and standing close to the fire until feeling returned to his extremities. When he'd stopped shaking, he turned his attention to the cabin's interior, taking in the neat organization, the well-stocked shelves, the evidence of productive domestic life. "You weren't exaggerating about being snowed in," he said finally. "Took me 5 hours to get here. Trail's barely passable, even on horseback." "Then perhaps next time you'll wait for better weather before conducting unnecessary inspections." Elias stood with arms crossed, not offering the marshal a seat. "Not unnecessary. Got more reports from town. People talking about how strange it is, you living out here with children. Wondering if maybe the arrangement needs closer scrutiny. People talk because they're bored, not because they have genuine concerns." Elias's voice had gone cold. "And you ride out here in dangerous conditions to satisfy their gossip. Seems like poor judgment for a lawman." Thomas's expression hardened. "I'm doing my job, which is ensuring children in this territory are properly cared for. You got a problem with that?" "I've got a problem with harassment disguised as concern." Elias moved to stand between the marshal and where Lena and Mara sat on their bed. "You've been here twice now. Both times you've found healthy, well-fed children living in safe conditions. What exactly are you looking for that you haven't already seen?" "Maybe I'm looking for why a man who's lived alone for 7 years suddenly decides to take in 2 girls. That strike you as normal behavior?" "Normal?" Lena's voice cut through the tension before she could stop herself. "What's normal? Selling children on auction blocks? Separating families because it's more convenient? Leaving orphans to starve in institutions that run out of funding? Because that's what passes for normal in this territory." "Lena." Elias's tone carried warning, but she ignored it. "No, he needs to hear this. You want to know why Elias took us in? Because he was the only person at that auction who cared that we wanted to stay together. Because he's fed us every single day, taught us how to survive, and never once raised his hand to us or made us feel like we're nothing. If that's suspicious to you, then maybe you should question what kind of world we're living in where basic human decency is seen as evidence of wrongdoing." The cabin went silent except for the fire's crackle. Thomas stared at her, his expression unreadable. Elias had gone very still, not intervening but clearly calculating the consequences of her outburst. "You've got a sharp tongue for someone so young," Thomas said finally. "I've got experience that made it sharp." Lena lifted her chin. Are you going to do something productive, or are you just here to waste everyone's time with suspicions based on nothing? I'm here to protect children who can't protect themselves. Then protect us by leaving us alone. Mara's voice came small but clear from behind Lena. We're happy here. We're safe. Why can't that be enough? Thomas looked at the little girl who'd barely spoken during his previous visits, surprise evident on his weathered face. He turned back to Elias, something in his expression shifting. You're raising them to be fighters, he observed. I'm teaching them to survive. Fighting's part of that. Elias's stance remained defensive. Are we done here? The marshal finished his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate care. For now, but I'll be back come spring, and if anything's changed, if those girls show any signs of mistreatment, or if your situation looks anything other than legitimate, I'll remove them faster than you can argue paperwork. Spring it is, then. Elias moved toward the door, opening it to reveal the frozen landscape beyond. Safe travels, Marshal. Hope the trail doesn't kill you before you reach town. Thomas departed without further comment, his horse struggling back through the snow while the three of them watched from the cabin window. When he'd finally disappeared from view, Elias closed the door and turned to face Lena. That was reckless, he said quietly. I know. You challenged a lawman twice now. He could make trouble for all of us if you push him too far. I know that too. Lena met his gaze steadily. But he keeps coming here looking for problems that don't exist, and someone needed to tell him the truth. The truth doesn't always protect you. Elias moved to bank the fire, adding logs to replace the heat lost when the door had been open. In fact, sometimes it makes you more vulnerable. Then I'll be vulnerable. Lena's voice carried a conviction that surprised even herself. But I won't stand by and let him suggest terrible things about someone who's been nothing but decent to us. Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression complex. You're loyal. That's admirable and dangerous in equal measure. Just remember, loyalty without strategy can destroy what you're trying to protect. The incident with the marshal cast a shadow over the following weeks, a reminder that their situation existed at the mercy of people who viewed unconventional arrangements with suspicion. Elias grew more careful about their visibility, turning down an invitation from Martha to bring the girls to town for a holiday gathering, declining when neighbors offered to visit and meet his wards. Safer if people forget we're here, he explained when Lena questioned his refusal. Less attention means less scrutiny, and scrutiny's what gets arrangements like ours challenged. Winter deepened, each storm arriving with less warning than the last. They developed routines for blizzard days. Extra firewood brought inside, water buckets filled, livestock checked and secured. The cabin became their entire world, its four walls containing all the space they needed to work and rest and occasionally play when the work was done. On evenings when the wind howled too loud for sleep, Elias taught them card games his father had taught him, simple contests of luck and memory that made Mara laugh with genuine delight when she won. He showed them how to carve simple figures from soft wood, how to braid rope from dried grass, how to occupy long dark hours without going mad from confinement. My father used to say that winter separates those who can endure from those who just exist, Elias told them one particularly brutal evening. People who can't find purpose in stillness don't last in places like this. What's your purpose? Lena asked. He considered the question seriously. Used to be just survival, getting through each day, each season, proving I could make it alone. His eyes found them across the cabin. Lately, it's become more complicated than that. Complicated how? Complicated like realizing maybe survival isn't enough. Maybe there's supposed to be more than just not dying. He returned to the rope he was braiding, his hands moving through familiar patterns. Haven't figured out what that more is yet. Still working on it. Spring felt impossibly distant, but time moved regardless of how slowly the days passed. January gave way to February, and the worst of the storms finally began to space themselves out, arriving weekly rather than every few days. The snowpack remained deep, but the sun started climbing higher in the sky, promising eventual thaw. One morning in late February, Lena woke to find Elias standing at the window with an expression she'd never seen before, something between hope and fear, anticipation mixed with dread. What's wrong? She asked, joining him at the glass. Nothing's wrong, it's just... He gestured toward the eastern horizon. 6 months today. The guardianship papers expire at midnight. Lena felt her stomach drop. She'd known this day was coming, had tried not to think about what it might mean. What happens now? Now we find out if the marshal accepts a renewal application or if he decides to challenge the arrangement. Elias turned from the window, his face returning to its usual neutral mask. I filed the paperwork 2 weeks ago when I made that supply run. Should hear back any day. And if he says no? Then we figure out the next step. One way or another, I'm not letting you get sent back to an orphanage or another auction block. His voice carried absolute certainty. That's a promise, and I don't make promises I can't keep. 3 days later, Marshal Thomas arrived for the third time. The weather had cleared enough that his journey was merely difficult rather than life-threatening, and he rode into the clearing with an envelope visible in his coat pocket. Elias met him outside, not inviting him in this time. Lena and Mara watched through the window, hands clasped tight together, waiting to learn whether their fragile stability would be allowed to continue or whether they'd be torn away from the first real home they'd known. The conversation between the two men was brief, their body language tense. Thomas handed over the envelope, spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, then remounted his horse. Before leaving, he looked toward the cabin window where the girls stood watching and offered the slightest nod. Acknowledgement or approval, it was impossible to tell. Elias waited until the marshal had ridden out of sight before returning to the cabin. He held the opened envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. Well? Lena couldn't keep the desperation from her voice. Guardianship's been extended another 6 months, with possibility for permanent adoption after that period if all parties are willing. He handed her the official document, its formal language making their situation legally sound for at least another half-year. He wrote a note at the bottom. Says he still has reservations, but that he can't justify removing children from a situation that's clearly working. Says he'll check in quarterly, but that he won't harass us unnecessarily anymore. Lena read the note herself, hardly daring to believe what it meant. We can stay? You can stay. Elias's voice was rough with an emotion he didn't name. At least until August. After that, we can apply for something more permanent if everyone agrees that's what they want. Is it? Lena asked, needing to hear him say it. Is it what you want? Elias looked at her, then at Mara, who'd started crying with relief, then back at the cabin that had somehow transformed from a hermit's refuge into something resembling a family home. I didn't want this initially, didn't plan for it, didn't think I needed it. But wanting and needing aren't always the same thing. He moved to the fire, adding wood with careful precision. What I want is to see you both make it through this winter and the next, and however many come after that. What I want is to know that standing on that auction block and insisting you stay together actually mattered in the long run. That good enough? That's good enough, Lena whispered. That night, after celebration had been marked with a slightly larger supper and Mara had fallen asleep smiling, Lena and Elias sat by the fire in their usual evening quiet. The cabin felt different somehow. The same 4 walls containing something new and fragile. The beginning of permanence, the possibility of truly belonging. Thank you, Lena said softly, for fighting for us, for not giving up when it would have been easier to let the marshal take us. Didn't fight for you, Elias corrected, his tone gentle. Fought with you. There's a difference. You spoke up when it mattered, defended this arrangement even when it was dangerous to do so. That's what convinced the marshal, not anything I said. We're a team, then. Suppose we are. He looked at her with something that might have been pride. Strange how that happened when I wasn't paying attention. Outside, the wind had calmed to almost nothing, and through the cabin window the stars burned cold and bright in a clear winter sky. Inside, the fire crackled warm and safe, and 3 people who'd started as strangers bound by desperate circumstances settled into the quiet understanding that they'd somehow become something more. Not quite a family yet, but moving in that direction with every day that passed. Spring would come eventually, bringing the thaw and new challenges and the next test of whether their fragile arrangement could survive scrutiny and time. But tonight, for the first time since the auction block, Lena allowed herself to feel something beyond survival instinct and protective fear. She felt hope, tentative and careful, that maybe tomorrow wouldn't require constant fighting, that maybe, against all odds and expectations, They'd found a place where being unwanted children was slowly transforming into being chosen family. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. March arrived with false promises of warmth, days where the sun climbed high enough to melt the top layer of snow before temperatures plummeted again at night, creating treacherous ice that made every step outside the cabin a calculated risk. The world was caught between seasons, winter refusing to release its grip while spring pushed insistently at the edges of frozen ground. Elias had grown quieter as the guardianship extension settled into their daily reality, his silence different from the comfortable companionship they'd developed. Lena noticed him watching them sometimes when he thought they weren't paying attention, his expression complex and unreadable. She wondered what thoughts moved behind those storm-gray eyes, what calculations he was making about their future. The answer came on a morning when weak sunlight filtered through windows still partially covered by diminishing snowdrifts. Elias had been outside checking the livestock when he returned with urgency tightening his movements. He closed the door carefully, removed his coat with deliberate precision, and stood by the fire without speaking for long enough that Lena set aside her sewing. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing happened. Something's coming." He turned to face them, his jaw set in the way that meant he'd made a difficult decision. "The guardianship extension buys us time, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Come August, the marshal will want a permanent solution. Either I adopt you officially, or he'll push for placement with a proper family." "You're not proper," Mara's voice carried genuine confusion. "I'm a widower living alone in wilderness. Society doesn't consider that ideal circumstances for raising children, especially girls." Elias moved to the table, sitting heavily. "I've been thinking about this since the extension was approved, about what it means to make this permanent, what that would require." Lena felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "You're having second thoughts." "No." The word came firm, immediate. "I'm having first thoughts about how to do this right, instead of just surviving day to day." He gestured for them to sit across from him. "If I'm going to adopt you officially, we need to address things we've been avoiding, like education, like what happens when you're older and need opportunities I can't provide out here, like the fact that I have no idea how to raise daughters properly, and I'm making most of this up as I go." "You're doing fine," Lena said quietly. "Fine isn't good enough. You deserve better than fine." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Martha mentioned her sister could provide advice on raising girls. I've been too proud to accept that help, but pride's a luxury we can't afford if we're making this permanent. And there's the matter of schooling. You can read, Lena, but Mara needs to learn, and I'm not qualified to teach beyond basic survival skills." "What are you saying?" Lena's voice had gone small with fear that he was building toward a conclusion she couldn't bear to hear. "I'm saying we need to change how we live. Not drastically, but enough that when the marshal comes in August, he sees a legitimate household capable of raising children properly." Elias's expression softened slightly. "I'm saying I want to adopt you both officially, but I need to prove I can give you lives beyond just survival. That means accepting help, integrating more with town, maybe even building additions to the cabin so you have proper space as you get older." The words hung in the morning air, heavy with implication. Lena tried to process what he was offering, not just temporary shelter but actual family, legal and recognized. The idea felt too large to hold, too precious to trust completely. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why go through all that trouble?" Elias was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because somewhere between that auction block and now, you stopped being obligations and became people I care about. Because Mara laughs when she wins at cards, and you defend us to lawmen like we're worth protecting. Because this cabin feels less like a tomb and more like a home when you're in it." He met their eyes steadily. "And because my wife would have wanted me to do this, to help children who needed help, to build something good from the grief that's been eating me for 7 years. Mara slipped from her chair and moved to Elias's side, pressing against his arm in the wordless affection she'd begun showing recently. He stiffened briefly, then relaxed, one hand coming up to rest awkwardly on her head. "So we start making changes," he continued. "Today I ride to town, talk to Martha's sister about what we need to do. Tomorrow we start teaching Mara her letters. Next week we begin planning cabin additions so you're not sharing one bed forever. We do this properly, step by step, until there's no question that this arrangement is legitimate." "What if it's not enough?" Lena asked, voicing the fear that lived constant in her chest. What if the marshal decides it's still not proper? Or what if people in town make enough trouble that he has no choice but to remove us? Then we fight harder. Elias's voice carried steel beneath the calm surface. I didn't survive 7 years alone in wilderness by giving up when things got difficult. And I'm not about to let bureaucracy and small-minded gossip destroy what we've built here. He left for town an hour later, riding out on the bay gelding with promises to return before dark. Lena and Mara watched him go, then turned back to the cabin that suddenly felt both more secure and more fragile than before. The prospect of permanence made everything matter more. Every choice, every action, every moment they proved themselves capable of being a family. Are we really going to stay forever? Mara asked, her hand finding Lena's. I think we might be. Lena squeezed her sister's fingers gently. If we can prove we belong here. They spent the day in industrious preparation, cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than usual, organizing supplies with extra care, practicing the kind of domestic competence that would demonstrate they were well-managed children in a functioning household. When Elias returned just before sunset, he found them setting the table for supper with the careful precision of people trying to prove their worth. Met with Martha's sister, woman named Caroline, he announced, hanging his coat by the door. She's tough, but fair. Gave me a list of things we need to address. Proper schooling, appropriate clothing for town visits, social integration so you're not isolated out here. He pulled folded papers from his pocket. Also stopped by the territorial office. Got the preliminary adoption forms. Process takes months, requires character witnesses and periodic inspections, but it's doable if we're serious. We're serious, Lena said immediately. I know you are. Question is whether I can meet all the requirements they're going to impose. He spread the papers on the table, studying the dense legal language. They'll want to see that you attend school, that you have appropriate female guidance, that you're being raised according to proper social standards. That last part's going to be hardest. I'm not exactly a model of proper social behavior. Neither are we, Lena pointed out. We stood on an auction block being sold like tools. Proper society already decided we weren't worth keeping. Then we'll prove them wrong. Elias gathered the papers carefully. Starting tomorrow, everything changes. We stop hiding out here like we're ashamed of this arrangement. We integrate with town, we follow every rule they set, and we show them that unconventional doesn't mean improper. The transformation began gradually but thoroughly. Elias arranged for Lena and Mara to attend school in Timber Ridge 3 days a week, riding them into town at dawn and collecting them each afternoon. The teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Brennan, viewed them with initial suspicion that slowly shifted to grudging approval as Lena proved her literacy and Mara demonstrated quick learning despite her limited prior education. Caroline visited the cabin weekly, ostensibly to provide domestic guidance, but actually conducting careful assessment of their living situation. She taught Lena advanced sewing techniques, showed them how to preserve food more efficiently, and offered advice on managing a household that went far beyond mere survival. Her reports back to town were cautiously positive, noting that while unconventional, the arrangement showed genuine care and competence. Marshal Thomas made his quarterly inspection in May, arriving unannounced as promised, but with noticeably less hostility than previous visits. He observed their daily routines, questioned them separately about their treatment and happiness, and reviewed the adoption paperwork with meticulous attention to detail. You've made changes, he acknowledged to Elias after completing his inspection. Real ones, not just surface adjustments to satisfy legal requirements. We're trying to do this right, Elias replied. That means accepting that I can't do it alone. Most people don't figure that out until it's too late. Thomas folded the inspection report and tucked it into his jacket. I'm recommending approval for the adoption. Won't be final until August at earliest, and there's still risk that territorial authorities could override my recommendation. But based on what I've seen, you're providing better care than most traditional families manage. After he left, Elias stood in the clearing staring at the trail long after the marshal had disappeared. Lena joined him, uncertain what to say. Think it's really going to happen? She finally asked. Starting to believe it might. He turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression held something close to hope. We've got 3 more months to prove we can maintain this. 3 months to show that we're not just surviving together, but actually building something that lasts. Those 3 months passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Elias began construction on a small addition to the cabin, working long hours to frame out a separate room where the girls could have privacy as they grew older. Neighbors who'd been distant started offering assistance, their suspicion gradually replaced by grudging respect for the strange household that was somehow making an impossible situation work. Lena thrived in school, her hunger for education feeding on every lesson and book Mrs. Brennan provided. She learned mathematics and geography, history and literature, accumulating knowledge with the desperation of someone who understood that education was power and power meant options. Mara blossomed under the attention, her silence finally breaking completely as she discovered the joy of reading simple words and writing her own name in careful letters. The cabin filled with small signs of permanence, books on shelves that Elias built specifically for that purpose, hooks for school bags, a slate board where Mara practiced her letters. The changes were subtle but significant, transforming the space from a hermit's refuge into a home designed for multiple lives lived in companionship rather than solitude. In late July, Martha arrived at the cabin with news. She rode in on a hot afternoon when the girls were practicing their reading in the shade and Elias was working on the room addition. Her expression was serious enough that Lena's stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. "Don't panic," Martha said immediately, dismounting. "It's not bad news, just complicated news." Elias set down his tools and approached, wariness evident in his posture. "What kind of complicated?" "The Territorial Adoption Board wants to conduct a final review before approving your application. They're sending a representative next week to do comprehensive evaluation." Martha handed him an official letter. "It's standard procedure for unusual cases, but I wanted you to have warning so you're prepared." "Define comprehensive," Elias said, scanning the letter. "They'll interview everyone separately, inspect the living conditions, review school records, talk to neighbors and character witnesses. Basically, they'll examine every aspect of your household to determine if adoption is in the children's best interest." Martha's expression softened. "I know you've been working toward this, but understand they'll look for any reason to deny the application. Single men adopting children, especially girls, faces enormous scrutiny." "We've done everything they asked," Lena interjected, unable to stay silent. "We go to school, we have proper guidance, we're integrated with the community. What more do they want?" "They want assurance that you're safe and properly cared for, and they want certainty that this arrangement isn't hiding something inappropriate." Martha's bluntness was kind in its honesty. "I believe in what you've built here, and I'll testify to that. But prepare yourselves for difficult questions and intense scrutiny." The week before the evaluation passed intense preparation. They cleaned the cabin until every surface gleamed, organized their belongings to demonstrate proper management, rehearsed answers to potential questions. Caroline visited daily, coaching them on how to present themselves, what to emphasize, what concerns the evaluator might have. "Be honest," she advised repeatedly. "Don't try to pretend you're something you're not. They'll see through false perfection faster than genuine effort." The territorial representative arrived on a morning that felt too ordinary for such a consequential event. She was a woman in her middle years named Mrs. Harrison, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family dysfunction and wouldn't be easily fooled by pleasant appearances. She spent 3 days at the cabin and in town, conducting exhaustive interviews and inspections. She questioned Lena and Mara separately about their treatment, their happiness, any concerns they might have. She examined their sleeping arrangements, their clothing, their schoolwork. She spoke with Mrs. Brennan, Caroline, Martha, Marshall Thomas, and several neighbors who'd observed their household from a distance. On the final day, she called them together in the cabin for a concluding interview. Her expression gave nothing away as she arranged her papers on the table and gestured for them to sit. "I've completed my evaluation," she began without preamble. "I'll be submitting my report to the Territorial Board within the week, and they'll make final determination on the adoption application." She paused, studying each of them in turn. "But I'd like to share my preliminary findings with you now." Lena felt Mara's hand grip hers under the table, felt Elias go rigid beside them. Everything they'd built, everything they'd become, hung on whatever this woman was about to say. "This is an unusual situation," Mrs. Harrison continued. A widower with no child-rearing experience takes in two orphaned sisters and attempts to create a functional household in isolated wilderness. By conventional standards, it shouldn't work. The risks are numerous, the challenge is substantial, and the potential for failure or worse is significant. She set down her papers. However, conventional standards don't always account for human resilience and genuine care. "What are you saying?" Elias asked quietly. "I'm saying that despite the unconventional nature of your arrangement, I've observed something rare. A household built on mutual respect, honest effort, and authentic care for each other's welfare. These children are healthy, educated, and demonstrably happy. They speak about you with affection rather than fear, with trust rather than obligation." Mrs. Harrison's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Crow, you've accepted guidance where others would have refused it out of pride. You've integrated with community despite your preference for isolation. You've prioritized these children's needs above your own comfort repeatedly. Those aren't the actions of someone exploiting a situation for improper purposes. You're approving the adoption?" Lena hardly dared to speak the words. "I'm recommending approval with continued oversight. The territorial board has final say, but my recommendation carries significant weight." She pulled out a document and set it before Elias. "This is a provisional approval. If the board accepts my recommendation, you'll have full legal custody within 6 weeks. There will be annual reviews for the next 3 years to ensure the arrangement remains appropriate, but barring unforeseen circumstances, these children will be yours." The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the usual sounds of wind and forest seemed to pause, waiting for someone to break the moment. Mara started crying first, quiet tears of relief and joy that quickly became sobs. Lena felt her own eyes burning, her throat too tight for words. Elias sat very still, his hands flat on the table, his expression struggling to contain emotion that had been locked away for too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with feeling he didn't try to hide. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing what we've built here instead of just what we look like on paper." "Thank the girls," Mrs. Harrison replied. "They defended this household with more passion than I've witnessed in 20 years of conducting evaluations, and they demonstrated in every interaction that they feel safe, valued, and loved. Those are the metrics that matter most." She left an hour later, riding away with promises to send official notification once the territorial board made their final decision. The three of them stood in the clearing watching her disappear down the trail, none of them quite believing what had just happened. "Is it really over?" Mara asked, her voice small with cautious hope. "Not completely over," Elias said. "Still have to wait for final approval, and there will be reviews, but yes, the hardest part is behind us." "What happens now?" Lena asked. Elias looked at the cabin, at the partially completed addition, at the life they'd somehow constructed from desperation and determination. "Now we keep living. We finish the room addition so you have proper space. We continue school, continue learning, continue proving that unconventional doesn't mean broken." He turned to face them fully. "And we stop waiting for permission to be a family. We already are one. Has been for months now. The paperwork will just make it official." 6 weeks later, the official documents arrived via courier from the territorial capital. Elias read them twice before speaking, his hands trembling slightly as he held the papers that transformed temporary guardianship into permanent adoption. "It's approved," he said finally. "You're legally mine. Not mine as in property, mine as in family, as in daughters." The word hung in the air between them, enormous and transformative. Daughters. Not wards, not charges, not temporary obligations. Daughters. Lena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there finally loosening. "We have a last name now," she said wonderingly. "We're Lena and Mara Crow." "Sounds right," Mara said, testing it out. "Better than just being orphans with numbers in a ledger." That evening, they celebrated with a meal that was slightly more elaborate than usual. Venison roasted with herbs from the garden, vegetables preserved from last fall's harvest, bread that Lena had learned to make under Caroline's patient instruction. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, prepared in a home that was legally and emotionally where they belonged. After supper, as they sat around the fire in the comfortable quiet that had become their normal, Elias pulled out a small wooden box that Lena had never seen before. He opened it carefully, revealing a delicate ring and a folded piece of cloth. "This was my wife's," he said, handling the items with reverent care. "Her wedding ring and a handkerchief her mother embroidered for her. I've been saving them, not sure what to do with them." He looked at Lena and Mara. "But I think she'd want you to have them." "Not now. You're too young for wedding rings. But someday, when you're grown and getting married yourselves, these should belong to you. So you know that you're part of a history that goes beyond just the three of us." Lena accepted the box with shaking hands, understanding the weight of what he was offering. Not just physical objects, but connection, legacy, proof that they weren't just rescued children, but genuine family being woven into a story that had begun before they arrived and would continue long after. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for not letting them separate us, for fighting when it would have been easier to give up, for turning us into a family when we were just scared children on an auction block." "You turned us into a family," Elias corrected gently. "I just provided the space for it to happen. You're the ones who filled that space with life and laughter and the kind of stubborn determination that makes the impossible merely difficult." As autumn approached and the world began its slow turn toward winter again, the cabin stood warm and secure in its clearing, smoke rising from the chimney into crisp air. Inside, three people who'd started as strangers built their life together, a life built on honesty and hard work, and the understanding that family wasn't always what you were born into, but sometimes what you chose to build from broken pieces. Lena still had nightmares sometimes about the auction block, about hands reaching to separate her from Mara, about standing vulnerable and exposed while adults decided her worth. But she woke in a bed that was hers, in a room that smelled of pine and wood smoke, with her sister breathing peacefully beside her and the sound of Elias moving through the cabin preparing for another day. They weren't perfect. Elias still struggled with expressing affection, retreating into silence when emotions ran too high. Lena carried anxiety that manifested in overworking and trying to prove her value constantly. Mara had moments when the trauma of their early separation surfaced in nightmares and clinging fear, but they worked through these imperfections together. Learning that family meant accepting each other's damage while helping heal what could be healed. The cabin addition was completed by October, providing the girls with a room of their own that held 2 beds, a small shelf for their growing collection of books, and a window that looked east toward the sunrise. They decorated it simply but with care, a quilt that Caroline had helped them sew, wildflowers pressed between pages and mounted on the walls, small carved figures that Elias had made during long winter evenings. Marshal Thomas made his final inspection in November, finding nothing to criticize and everything to approve. "You've built something good here," he told Elias as he prepared to leave. "Something that shouldn't work according to all the rules and social expectations, but does anyway because you all decided it was worth fighting for. That's rare. Don't take it for granted." "We won't," Elias promised. As the first snow of their second winter together began to fall, coating the world in fresh white silence, Lena stood at the cabin window watching flakes drift down through the forest canopy. Mara was at the table practicing her writing, forming letters with careful precision. Elias was by the fire mending harness, his hands steady in their familiar work. This was home. Not perfect, not what anyone would have predicted, but real and solid in theirs. They'd traveled impossible distances from that scorching afternoon in Red Hollow, from the terror of separation and the desperation of auction blocks. They'd found their way through winter storms and legal scrutiny, through their own fears and society's suspicions, to arrive at this moment of peace. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, noticing her stillness. Lena turned from the window, taking in the cabin that held everything that mattered. "I'm thinking that sometimes the best things aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones you build from whatever pieces you're given, even when those pieces seem all wrong for what you're trying to create." Wise observation for someone so young. "I had good teachers." She smiled at him, then at Mara, who looked up from her writing with ink-stained fingers and a matching smile. "We all did." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the wilderness in white silence. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady, and 3 people who'd been strangers lived as family, their improbable household proving that sometimes the heart recognizes home long before law or society catches up. They'd fought for each other when no one else would, had built something lasting from temporary arrangements and desperate hope. And in the end, that fighting mattered. That hope mattered. The auction block was behind them, the fear of separation finally laid to rest. They were Lena, Mara, and Elias Crow. A family not because they'd been born to it, but because they'd chosen it with every difficult day and every small act of care that accumulated into love. The cabin door was closed against the winter cold, but inside there was warmth and light and the sound of small joys, a child's laughter, the crackle of fire, the quiet satisfaction of work done well. They'd found their way home at last, and that home would hold them through whatever seasons came next. It was enough. It was everything. It was exactly what they'd needed all along.